Well, thank you all very much, and thank you most of all to the invitation committee for letting us come here for this World Logic Day. Now, you may think that this is a title that I picked for myself, but you have to understand that in this room there is a very real boss. Now, I'm not going to point. No. And two of us got emails at the same time, and the email said, Manuel, you will talk on algebraic logic. Patrick, you will answer the question, what does logic have to do with philosophy? And of course, we are both very proud people, and so we raised ourselves up and said, yes, Mara. We'll do that, yes. And he's done it. Now it's my turn to do that. Actually, I think it's a very good question, because I think it's a very hard question to answer, because if you even begin to start thinking about the history of philosophy and the history of logic, you'll see that what we mean by logic, what we mean by philosophy, have had very, very different relations to two changing things, logic, philosophy. They've had a different relation over time and over place. And look, I've just splashed a few pictures up here of people who we might say maybe are more philosophical than logical, or more logical than philosophy, but at some way with all of them, we can see the connection. Okay? For example, just starting randomly, we can see the two Greek figures. Who's the founder of logic? Well, some people, of course, will point up the top and say, of course, it's Aristotle. Me, I'm much more tended to point out, no. It's Socrates, with the debate, with the interaction, with the flow of the game. Some people will be tempted to say, oh, there's no such thing as logic in Chinese philosophy, but then you point at somebody like Zhuangzi, who you may have heard of the famous butterfly story, or you may have heard of his other paradoxes, or you may also have heard about his explicit discussions about the relative roles of, let's say, intuition and rationality. You could point at other people up there. One of the greats, Peirce, who invented the modern notation that we use today. Peirce gave it to Schroeder, Schroeder gave it to Peano gave it to Russell, and now we call it Russellian notation, but no, it goes back to Peirce. We've got Frege, of course. Oh, we've got Kant, a wonderful applied logician. He had a problem. Hume had given us skepticism. Oh, I can solve it. And we get the transcendental deduction and all of this. Oh, what a wonderful exercise in applied modal logic. Oh, and there's Wittgenstein, the ambiguous. The Tractatus person. Ooh, is that logical positivism? Is that logic? And then we get the Wittgenstein of the investigations, the language games, the playing, the impossibility of defining things, the impossibility of even defining a games. Two faces in one. Now, there's a lot of easy stories that you can tell about how logic and philosophy go together. And mostly I don't like these stories. These are what I call philosophical toothbrush stories. Here it is. Here's your philosophy. Oh, it's a bit dirty, isn't it? But never mind. If you use this nice electric toothbrush, make sure 2 minutes every time. And actually, you should do a bit of the brush things as well. But do it for 30 minutes, do it for 2 minutes every time a day, and soon your philosophy will be nice and clean. Now, lots and lots of people like telling stories about like this. I don't really like such stories. There's two reasons I don't like such stories. In the first place, I find them boring. If that's all there is to logic, you may as well go out and shoot yourself. But secondly, there's a deeper point, and this is to come back to the point that we were talking about at first. When somebody can confidently give such an answer, we should use logic in philosophy because it usually means that he or she has got a very, very firm and clear idea about exactly what philosophy is, and usually exactly what logic is. And yeah, it may work for that. It's boring, but it may work for that. But as I said, I don't have any particularly strong feelings about what either logic is or philosophy is or what they should be. Because I can see the history of these subjects. I can see the change of these subjects. And I know that the world is now entering into very, very, very difficult and uncharted times where we probably need to think very hard about what logic means in the modern world and how one should do philosophy. So let me move along. This is my basically thing I would like to say about logic. Logic should surprise philosophy. That's one of its fundamental goals. Let me give you a few of the big ways that I think logic has surprised philosophy in the past. These are big topics, much too big for this, much too big for me, and much too big for the remaining time I have. Now, here are some of the ones that if I think about the things I have read over the years or the things when I've been thinking about philosophy of science or epistemology, here are some of the things, and as a logician, here are some of the things that come to mind for me. Pythagoras, the proof that the square root of 2 is not rational, a beautiful proof, a proof by contradiction, compelling, simple, and wonderful. Euclid, having the crazy, stupid idea that you can get all of truth about space and time into 5 axioms, one of which admittedly is a little bit complicated. And doing that, an amazing idea. Bolyai, Riemann, and Gauss, discovering that actually non-Euclidean geometries make sense. Sorry, Kant. Russell, the set of sets that do not contain themselves, and Gödel, the big 3. The completeness theorem for first-order logic, the incompleteness theorem for arithmetic, and of course the consistency, the relative consistency proof for set theories, which of course was later completed by Cohen, so to speak, to show the freedom that we have in, so to speak, mathematical metaphysics. Now, I love these surprises, but how can I put it? This is mathemagic. Here we're really treading on a deep philosophical problem. Is this logic or is this mathematics? Where are we standing? And it's just in one direction. One of the points I would like to get across in this talk is that logic isn't just about techie stuff, sciencey stuff, physicsy stuff, mathematical stuff. No, it's about other kinds of stuff. Or it could be, and it should be. So let me try and steer the talk in that direction. I just want to ask, do any of you recognize that picture, what it is? Can anybody tell me what that's a picture of? Let me hear it again. Say it one more time. Say it one more time. Exactly. It's Amsterdam University, which is a magic school. For teaching logicians. Yeah, so you're right, it's the University of Amsterdam. And one of the things that I think is interesting with a lot of modern logic is it's moving into the hard parts of science. And the hard parts of science for me are not the physics. I mean, that's easy. Give it enough money. When you talk to an electron, it doesn't budge around too much. And we've got the quantum rules to do that. They're not really hard like people are. That's where science has really had problems. So the world of cognition, the world of the social, the world of people. And I just want to sort of take you for a little tour into this world, for just a little tour, and to give you a little surprise. Not one of these big non-Euclidean geometries, but just a little surprise. And let's just go into the story. And like all good stories in English, it has to start with 4 magic words. Okay? Once upon a time. Once upon a time, 3 sisters were playing. 3 very clever sisters. Now, I must admit, I don't know what these sisters were called. Maybe they were called Anne, Bethany, and Clarissa, but that's not really important. The thing that's important is that they were clever. Okay? Now, 2 of them got mud on their foreheads. their foreheads here. They've got a piece of mud here. Now, again, because I know that these are very, very bad slides, and I want to apologize for everything, because, I meant to get this right. So. This looks wrong. It looks like they were rolling around in the mud, but actually that's just because it's a bad picture. There's just 3 little girls there, or maybe bigger girls, and 2 of them have got spots of mud on their forehead. And one of them doesn't, okay? And they've been playing all day, so there is one thing that they all know. They all know that at least one of them has mud on their forehead. Well, because they can all see that. Fine. And now the story gets a bit Freudian because things start to get weird, and it gets Freudian because now along comes Dad. And Dad is a very strange person, a very, very strange man. He comes along and he says, at least one of you has mud on your forehead. What? What? Why are you wasting our time, Dad? Why say such a thing? We all know that. Okay? What a silly daddy. I mean, all daddies are silly, we all know that. But the sad thing about this story is that Daddy hasn't finished being silly yet. Okay? He then asked them, do any of you know if you have mud on your forehead? Dad, why do you ask these dumb things? I mean, maybe I forgot to give you one of these things. How can I put it? These are all human beings, and they can't look to see themselves if they got mud on their forehead. And okay, I have heard of mirrors, but just as part of the story, there's no mirrors there, okay? So, yeah, I suppose maybe they could see the reflections in each other's eyes. No, they're all dark-eyed. They can't even do that. I don't know, okay? So, silly daddy, silly questions. Daddy asked the silly question again. Okay? Do any of you know if you have mud on your forehead? And you're not going to believe it, but the 2 sisters with mud on their forehead put up their hands, and the clean one didn't. Well, of course, that's our story, and you have to know how to finish a story as well, and there's magic words to finish a story in English as well. You say, and they all lived happily ever after. So that's nice, isn't it? So we can all say thank you. Still, there's 1 or 2 things that maybe we should think about here, because there's something a little strange about this story. Can the girls really know that they have mud on their foreheads? After all, they can't see themselves. Okay? Other questions. What about Daddy's role? What's the role of that initial announcement? When he says, at least one of you has mud on your forehead, isn't he telling them something that they all knew already? And what roles do these 2 questions play? And why does the first question have no apparent effect, and then the second one, yes? Why? Okay. Let's think about it. Now, suppose you are a girl with mud on your forehead. Close your eyes and think about it. When your father first asked you the question, of course, you have no idea how to answer. So, because remember I said, you're clever, you don't. You don't do anything, of course. Basically, you said, I don't know to the question. Ooh. Ooh, 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 ooh. But your sisters didn't say anything either. And as I said, you're a clever girl. You note it. I'm not sort of saying you write it down on a pen, but you're aware, you're there, we're all in this situation, you're there. What happens next? When Daddy asked the second time, you know something new. As I said, neither of your sisters knew the answer to the first question. And in particular, just close your eyes, think about it. You don't know what's on your forehead, but you can see one sister with mud on her hands. That's why you don't know. But why isn't she sticking up her hands? Ooh! The worst case scenario could be that you're one of the mud people and you see the clean forehead and the dirty. That's the worst case. That's the worst case. But you see your sister over there and she doesn't stick up her hand and she's seeing the clean space, and so the only person who could, oh, I must have mud myself. And as I said, maybe not everybody can work this out, but I did say 3 very clever little girls. And as I told you, the very cleverness is important in this story. Okay? My muddy sister could not only know if she sees someone with mud on her forehead, and that must be me. Just sit down and imagine whether you have that. But what about the father's initial announcement? What does it do? All it says is what the girls already know, doesn't it? And here's almost the point I would like to make why it's interesting. The point is actually, no, it doesn't. It changes the world. It changes the world. It changes the information content. Before all the 3 girls individually know this fact, when Daddy makes this announcement, suddenly they know that it's common knowledge. Knowledge of a far more abstract fact has entered into the arena. It's a much higher level, a much richer form of logic. It's not, to use the, Mara, am I allowed to use a technical term here? I'll just risk it, okay? It's not merely distributed knowledge anymore, it's common knowledge, okay? So the mud situation has become common knowledge. I know has become we all know. That's sort of the end of the story here, but what I want to do is to start working towards the things. Is this story of any philosophical interest? And I must admit, I chose this because it's a well-known example. It's easy, it's not a particularly deep thing or anything. Nonetheless, some of the concepts and some of the ideas it starts to point towards are interesting. In particular, the idea of common knowledge. The idea that something like this can have unexpected effects. The idea that something this abstract, changing in a way, this new form of common knowledge, this new form of social knowledge can enter the world and impact on the logic, make things now possible to be deduced that were not deduced before, have an impact in time, literally a statement coming that changes the world by changing the information contents of the world, okay? Something dynamic in action, something that moves. And this concept, I'm pointing to David Lewis here. There's many other interesting philosophers who've picked up on similarly interesting things. But for example, in his 1969 book, Convention, which roughly speaking means how we use money, communicate with each other, appreciate art, and so on, where we're social people interacting, and every move that we make, every action that we take, whether that's an action in the world or an action in the language world, an action in the information world, has an effect, okay? Also, this is just an aside of very, very, very great relevance in today's world of the internet. Like, I'm originally from New Zealand, but I now work in Denmark, and you probably have heard of somebody called Hans Christian Andersen and the Ugly Duckling and so on. But he wrote another very famous story called The Emperor's New Clothes, about the emperor who buys these clothes from some tricksters, and of course he doesn't get any clothes, and so he proudly walks naked through the streets of Copenhagen, and all his subjects are saying, "Oh, what wonderful clothes, Your Majesty! Oh, it's always wonderful!" Until, of course, a little boy says, "The emperor has no clothes," and everything comes down. This is all related with this kind of thing, this kind of social reasoning and so on. And I think it's fairly obvious if you look at some of the things that are happening today with what we regard as truth, what we regard as fake, all of these worlds, that thinking about these issues is important. It's also given us a lot of new logic. For example, I'm not sort of saying it's started the revolution or something like this, but this is pointing towards lots of interesting new work. There's the common knowledge operator itself. That's a tricky operator. It's linked very closely to things that you get in computer science and propositional dynamic logic and so on. Moreover, remember there was what Daddy did, the silly thing that Daddy did. At least one of you has got mud on your forehead. The idea of public announcement logics, the idea of dynamic logics which change things. this kind of story, this kind of scenario was one of the things that set these things going. I've already mentioned that I think this is very much closely linked also to the logics of social media. And if you look at writers like Jeremy Seligman, for example, or Fenrong Liu, or Alexandra Boltag, Sonia Smets, and so on, you'll find lots of interesting things here. There's also, I would say, very interesting links with developmental psychology. I don't know if any of you have come across things like false belief tests and autism and so on, but the sort of logic that you can investigate using these, asking both cognitive questions and social questions, and actually also asking, where does the cognitive become the social? Where does the social become the cognitive? Can the social be reduced to the cognitive? Is it a good idea to try? Should we change with the social? But let me just slow down a bit and move on towards the end of the talk. Because what I would like to do is I would just like to name some interesting philosophers for the most part, but also logicians whose work, I think, point in interesting directions that bear on this particular direction of logic. Now, maybe I will mention this guy first. That's Grice at the top, who I think is one of my favorite philosophers of language. So Grice, with his famous article, Logic and Conversation, basically in a sense saying, okay, everybody will shout at me for this, basically saying, don't think about logic in purely Aristotelian terms. Think of it also in Socratic or even sophistical terms. Look at how we use it, thereby inventing the modern field of pragmatics. Okay? And you can see some other very interesting writers right there. So that's, for example, is Rebecca Kukla down there, who's written a fantastic book. She's also worked with the logician Greg Beale. I'm sorry, I've got Greg Restall. She's worked with Greg Restall on the use of second-person utterances. She's written this magnificent book called Yo and Lo, with an appendix with some logical work with Greg Restall. It's just very, very brilliant. She's done lots of other wonderful work too. Over there, right above her, you've got, I think, a very interesting figure. That's Miranda Fricker, who I think is doing very interesting work in epistemology, basically taking into account the way that you are positioned in society impacts on arguments. There's a lovely, lovely, lovely thing in one of her papers when she takes a famous text in English. There's a famous American novel, an American film called To Kill a Mockingbird. It's sort of this iconic film, iconic novel written by Harper Lee. And she dissects the trial scene, which is the height of this novel, through an epistemic lens in terms of what she calls epistemic fairness. And I won't go on any further. I'll just be sort of saying logicians should be thinking about such concepts and can think about such comments. Over on this side, in a sense, you'd say that that's more the epistemology, but I must admit my tastes run a little bit more in the metaphysical direction. I've put David Lewis up there again because of conventions, though I must admit I don't much like David Lewis. I put Arthur Pryor there because he's a New Zealander like me, but also because he was interested in logics in which you step into the world and you're taking this centric perspective, this perspective from the subject, you might say, and looking around. But then there's two other very interesting ones doing very good metaphysical work. So there's Sally Haslanger, who combines, how can I put it, in a sense an epistemology, but trying to create, let's say, a realist account of various ways of constructing society and constructing ideas. A really magnificent philosopher. And that down there is Quentin Meillassoux, who actually loops back to the break between, let's say, the creation of Kantian, the creation of Kantian philosophy, and zeroes in on what is going there in a wonderful book called, in English, After Finitude, or in French, Après la Finitude, and zooms in on basically trying to sort of say, how much of the subject do we have in the world, how much of the world do we have in the subject, and can the Kantian decision to link the two, can that be overcome? What do we have to do? Anyway, there's lots and lots I could say. These are just some of my favorites, but these are, I think, examples of philosophers who in some sense are doing logic, or were, some of them are dead, because there's actually the sort of reverse slide to something I had here, because I think also philosophy should surprise logic. It should be a place where we go to look. It's not a one-way flow. Okay? The worst thing you can think about in doing logic is, the philosophers generate these problems, we try to solve them. In some sense, we should be changing sometimes what we think logic is by looking at what people with philosophical ideas are doing. And to be honest, you don't have to look very far in the history of logic to think of ideas like this. Did any of you ever hear of something called, maybe it's a bit technical, but what's the name? Intuitionistic logic? Good. Did anybody ever hear of something called, paraconsistent? Yes, you did. Okay, so philosophy should surprise logic and change the way that we do it. Okay, so I'd just like to say thank you all, and above all to Mara. Okay, and so thanks for watching this.